Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Achim Mambach. I'm the president of the ZEW, the Center for European Economic Research in Mannheim, and we're going to discuss for 1 hour the Draghi report, and I have some experts with me, which I will introduce in a second. The Draghi report has about 400 pages, more than 170 recommendations, so we calculated we have 1 hour, 60 minutes. That's one recommendation every 20 seconds. So good luck to all of us. How we will get through those recommendations, we will see. It's great that there's such a strong interest in the report. The report is really the program for the next European Commission. So it's worthwhile to think about not all recommendations, but some of them. 2 announcements before starting. We will put our webinar on YouTube, on our YouTube channel afterwards. So if we have some slides and you don't have to photograph them all, you will see them also on the channel if you want to see them. And we will go through the slides, and because it's a detailed report, I guess about 40 minutes, and then we have 20 minutes for Q&A. So please put your questions into the Zoom, and we try to answer them, but no guarantee. We will see how active you are and what questions are going to come up. Okay, so let's start. And I go to the slides again. Here we are. The Draghi report gives a very detailed analysis of the status quo, and that's noteworthy. I would love to see many more European reports coming up with such a detailed analysis. Where do we stand? Unfortunately, it's also very sober analysis. So what I put here is one slide where you see the GDP, the European one compared to the Chinese and the Americans. And if you take the lower slide, GDP and constant purchasing prices, the difference is about the last 20 years is about 16%. And if you see the growth rate here to the right is growth rate. In the United States, it was about 50% more than in Europe. On a per capita basis, disposable income has grown almost twice as much in the US as in the EU. Draghi calls it an existential challenge. So it's not just, not just a nuisance and, oh yeah, we're doing a little bit below what you might take out of this picture. It's a real challenge, and I'm actually very glad that he made this report. He has 3 main areas for actions and a strong call for more investments. And going through these 3 areas, we have our experts here. And one area for action is closing the innovation gap with the US and China. And I'm very happy that Irene Bercek is joining us. Irene Bercek, she's the head of our research unit on the digital economy, and he's a member of the Future Council of the German Chancellor. One further call for action is a joint plan for decarbonisation and competitiveness. And I'm happy that Sebastian Rausch is here. He heads the research unit on climate economics and is an expert on climate policy and its implication for industrial structures. The third call is increasing security and reducing dependencies. I will say a few words on that area for action. And then he calls for more investments. And we have Friedrich Heinemann in our group. And Friedrich, he heads our research unit on public finance with a strong focus on European public finance. Okay, so that's actually the agenda for our presentation. And I will directly head into it. But I have one slide with a general comment. It's all about European competitiveness, the report, and no one exactly knows what it means, European competitiveness, but I think in the end it will boil down to how can we strengthen our single market. And also the latter report was about the single market. And the picture I think many have in mind that we have these great companies and we have a great European single market, but somehow we are all like Gulliver, and you have to unleash Gulliver, or at least the European companies, and let them do their job and give them the freedom and let them work, and maybe the state has to support them. And one point he makes very strongly is that we have to reduce the regulatory burden on companies. And just to give you one figure, in the last cabinet of von der Leyen, about 13,000 European acts have been passed. In the same time, the United States, 3,000. The European Parliament, the European Commission is governing by rules. the budget is very small, or relatively small, so they govern by rules. And what we see to some degree is the collateral damage if there are so many rules coming up. So it's a strong call for reducing regulatory burden and applying the subsidiarity principle more strongly. However, there's also, I think some people believe, and Draghi apparently belongs to that group of people, that he thinks competition policy is also one of these burdens. Competition policy hinders firms to do what would be in our best interest. So he says that should not become a barrier to Europe's goals. And he wants to relax merger policy. He wants to see, I guess that's what he wants to see, as these European champions. But let me say that empirics is very clear on this point. If you have European champions, as you know, compared at the cost of competition, that will lead to less innovation, that will lead to higher prices. So I think he has some good recommendations on competition policy, but don't weaken it. I think competition policy makes the European single market stronger and not weaker. But still, because we have these European goals, we have to adapt it, but we don't have to get rid of it, of European policy. Okay, now gets into the topic, and I start with the first one. Or our first one, it's in his case, it was the third one. It's increasing security and reducing dependency. Again, the analysis is straight to the point. So I really recommend reading his report just for the analysis of where we stand today. And I have two slides taken out of his report. One is the processing of critical resources. And you see that here it's copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium, graphite, and rare earth. It's mostly being processed in China. It's not that they are coming from China. So in his report, there are two parts of this diagram. I only took one half of it, but it's, most is processed in China. And on the right-hand side, it's defense spending and compared to the United States and to China. And you see, I think, Europe has grown to some degree from 200 billion to 288 billion. Actually, it's a strong growth over this time, but still we are lacking to a large degree behind the United States. And I think the worry is what you see in China, and for Europe, what you see in Russia, but that's not in this diagram. So it's clear that we have to work on these two fields. So what are his proposals? And that's the slide I want to spend some time on it. One thing is on defense spending, defense coordination. And we did quite a few studies on that field. And actually Friedrich and his group did many studies on it. And here is one study. And if you want to read more, here's the QR code to the study. And it's quite clear that in defense, there is a clear European added value. So it makes sense to leverage it, defense spending, defense procurement on a European level to some more degree. And it would be great if also the Draghi report pushes that more in that direction. The second part on the slide here is about how can you make the economy more resilient? Here, that's a topic which is, I think, much less studied. It's one reason for the new revival of industrial policy. So do we need more industrial policy to be less vulnerable to supply chain interruptions, to other forms of interruptions? And what Draghi does is he tries to structure the sectors, and I will come to that one, in four broad cases, and also to steer the debate and to make the argument, where do we have to get more state involvement and where possibly not. And I think that's a good first step, and it really helps to think about these industries. What I did, I tried to make up my mind and kind of structure what he does with these four industries, and what you see is my mind. So that's the structure. So these are his four industries, and that's the structure, and I will come to that. But let me make two remarks before I come to those two general remarks. We have, I think, good arguments and also to some degree evidence that if you think about a resilient supply chain, you should start in the beginning of the supply chain, not at the end of the supply chain. And what Draghi does is he is to quite some degree working on the end of the supply chain. I think that's a mistake. that's kind of the old industrial policy. We should rather think is how do we strengthen the beginning of the supply chain, because interruptions then work through the whole supply chain. Second remark, that's a pure economic analysis. And I don't think that you can talk about resilience without security. I give you one example, what I mean by that. Take the Chinese car company BYD. So is it strategic, the automobile industry? Yes, we're very proud of our automobile industry, but probably wouldn't call it strategic. But where's the problem? Those cars come with a lot of cameras, they collect a lot of data, and that data is being transferred to China. So it's a security issue, it's not a pure economic issue. And I think one has to combine these two fields, and that's really a task which is ahead of us. Okay, but now let's go to those 4 cases here. And so one broad case of industry is where the EU has a strategic interest. And if we have a strategic interest, then we should really take care that the industry stays in the EU. So local content requirement, forced joint ventures. These are not my proposals; these are Draghis proposals. So that's, you know, it's a strong involvement in markets. Unfortunately, it's not clear what it means by strategic interest. And the German government seems to think at the moment that supporting the chip industry, so ships, cruise ships, has some strategic interest. Well, one might be skeptical whether that's really of strategic interest, but in any case, so there will be a debate what it means by strategic interest. Draghi himself says that it's not, you know, it's not one strategic interest for all of the time. It might shift what is an industry with a strategic interest. Okay, so these are the most important ones apparently. Then, if it's not strategic interest, but we might still care for production at home. So we're not care so much about we're a technology company, but we care about production at home. He mentioned as an example the car industry, the automobile industry. And then if you care for production at home, you might employ inward FDI, so that there's investment in Europe and trade measures, so to protect that industry to some degree. Again, why should we care about production at home? Is this employment policy? But why don't we do employment policy and rather than industrial policy? Is it innovation policy? Irene will talk later on innovation policy. But do we then care about production at home? I think the automobile industry is really a strong leader in innovation. So they invest a lot of innovation. But is that the reason why we care for production at home? I'm worried to some degree that opens the door for, you know, whatever people think at several points in time, you know, what we like to have production here because we like the company. So it might be a quite backward-looking case of industry. Okay, but that's production at home. If it's not strategic interest, if it's not production at home, then he has infant industries. Infant industries seem to be those which are infant, obviously, and they have an innovative edge. So something must be special with that industry. And if it's infant industry, then we should protect them. And here it's really, you know, that the Germans would probably call it the bazooka. Yeah, so apply the full range of trade distorting measures. So that's kind of a hard interference. Let me just say that infant industry is a concept which is actually, you know, typically used for developing countries. Yeah, so that's there they have to protect the industries. I don't see really how that can apply to Europe overall, that we really have to protect our infant industries with this full range of measures. Our companies, if we are going into new directions, it might be infant, but it's infant, you know, across the world. So then they should compete on their merits. But anyway, that's the third case of industry. And then if it's not infant industry, it's not, you don't care for production at home, it doesn't have a strategic interest, then there might be industries, you know, which just exist. And I think the point he's making here, there's somewhere the cost disadvantage is too large. So those industries or those sectors, you know, not infant, not care for production, not strategic, and cost disadvantage is too large, then just take it. You know, then we buy from other countries. And if you care about supply chain resilience, one should diversify suppliers. I think it's straightforward at this point, but it's still worth making. We have this debate about the solar industry. Yeah, and is the solar industry, is it strategic? I'm not sure. Do we care for production at home? Yes, sure, we always care for it, but it's, you know, is it specific? Is it an infant industry? It's not clear. I think this industry has already very strongly developed. And so there might be the point that one accepts it and says, okay, better diversify suppliers, but it's not for us to build up a soda industry. I think it's really worthwhile thinking about it, because what it means to have resilience it's not well understood, and all the governments are trying to find ways of really defining it. He recommends a resilience board, and that might actually be a good point. We also recommended that in a report for the German government to think about what is an industry, how resilient are they, can we do stress tests and so on. I think we will see much more in that direction. Okay, so that's the first area for action. We move to the second one, and we move to Irene. Draghi is saying, Irene, that the innovation gap is mostly digital. If without digital, I think we are, he says, we are kind of head on with the United States with regard to innovation. So it's digital. So is that right? And his proposals, are they right? Is that the right proposals to close the innovation gap? Irene, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, indeed, Europe is in a weak position with respect to digital technology. So we have a deficit here compared to the US and also compared to China. It's not the only issue, but it's one very big issue. And one reason for that is that, as Draghi points out, and this is also then shown in his analysis, that the European companies are very much specialized in mature and traditional technologies. And they spend much less on research and innovation than US companies. You see this in this left figure here. Here you see the R&D intensity as a percentage of GDP. And you see that while government, the share of government spending is basically the same in the EU and the US in relative terms, the share of business spending is much lower. And so, but also with respect to public spending, Draghi points out that there is insufficient focus on breakthrough innovations, on disruptive innovations. And many disruptive innovations are digital innovations. What comes in addition is that we have a weak pipeline between innovation and commercialization. And one reason for that is that there is much lower venture capital investment in Europe compared to the US. And in particular, this holds for the later stage investment. So, what are the suggestions of Draghi? There are many recommendations, in fact, and some of them are not new. Some of them focus on the framework conditions, and some of them cost a lot of money. And so more money, for instance, he suggests to increase the funds for the European Innovation Council, the European Investment Fund, the European Research Council, the Framework Program. Here he wants to double the budget to 200 billion euros. So this is really an immense increase. And then he also has suggestions with respect to changing the structure and the framework conditions. So one prominent suggestion is to transform the European Innovation Council to an ARPA-type agency, compared to the DARPA in the US, to allow for more disruptive innovation. He also suggests to promote academic excellence and world-leading institutions, and to promote mobility of researchers within the European Union. And then he has some suggestions regarding the regulatory framework, in particular with respect to artificial intelligence. So his suggestions on digital technology, they focus on artificial intelligence, and I think this is very important and is also the right direction, because this is the technological revolution we are dealing with now, and we have several indicators showing that the European Union is lagging behind the US and China. And so what Draghi suggests here is to invest more in your high-performance computing, sovereign cloud solutions, vertical priority plans, and so on and so forth. Now let me assess a little bit these suggestions. How should we prioritize? First of all, I think we have learned in the last years and decades many of the obstacles to innovate. We are aware of them, and main obstacles are bureaucratic burden for small and medium-sized companies, for startups, and so on. So decreasing this bureaucratic burden is really important and could also support the mobility for companies within the European Union, startups, and also the mobility for researchers. For instance, if we take the suggestion of Draghi to invent an EU-wide statute for innovative ventures so that they can move within the single market and do not have to take care of restrictions and regulatory frameworks that differ across different national frameworks, that would be a real progress. Then he has this focus on digital technologies and digital sovereignty. And let me point out again why this is so important. Digital technologies have the character of general purpose technologies. So having access to these technologies without one-sided dependencies and having the competence also to develop these technologies further, to apply them in different fields of other technologies and in different economic sectors is crucial for innovation and for productivity growth. So we cannot afford to lack in these technologies because they are so essential also for technological progress in, I don't know, clean technologies, production technologies, and so on and so forth. And this is related to the concept of digital sovereignty. That's why this focus in the Draghi report on digital technologies is really, I think, very good. Now, what Draghi suggests here, invest and collaborate, is important, but investment should not mean that we replicate the investment of the big hyperscalers in cloud infrastructure. We cannot do that. We do not just do not have the budget to do that. But still, we need some infrastructure to be able to apply our own AI models and also to develop the competencies to act with these with this infrastructure, yeah, because otherwise we would not be able to develop competencies and to apply these competencies in other technological fields. But with respect to applications in different sectors, we should consider the heterogeneity in the strength of the member states. Here, the Draghi report is a bit, I don't know, strict in prescribing in which sectors and technological fields AI should be applied. So here we should leave open the competitive forces to develop applications and technological progress. And then what is really crucial is to harmonize regulatory frameworks. We have now the AI Act, and we should implement it and interpret the implementation in a harmonized way across the European Union. The same is true for the GDPR. We have it implemented, it should be coherent with the AI Act, and we should interpret the rules in a harmonized way. And this is not true yet. So here the single market is not really single. Related to that is also the improvement of data availability and access. Here we really lag behind the US and China, and we have to get better on that. Then as regards some governance suggestions of Draghi, for instance, to establish an ARPA-type institution, I think it's important to build on existing experience and on lessons learned. We have already the so-called JD, the Joint European Disruptive Initiative. Does it work? Do we know what is good, what is bad about that? We should learn from that. In Germany, we have the Agency for Disruptive Innovation. What can we learn from that? And so on and so forth. And then finally, there should be also some room for assessing policy instruments and adapt them if necessary. So evaluation, adaptation is also an aspect that is maybe not that pronounced in the Draghi report. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Irene. And you make a strong point. Draghi is very good in the analysis, but we also have to become, I think, better in the evaluation and lessons learned from the measures we had. And I will come back to that. I have one question to you on the Lisbon agenda, because we once tried it already and we failed. So what did we learn from that one? But let me, before going there and asking you the question, let's move on to the third call for action. That's on decarbonization. And Sebastian, maybe as an entree question. So my feeling was that the previous von der Leyen government, that was all about combating climate change. It was, Green Deal, and now it's gone. Now we're talking about the clean industrial deal. So now it's all about competitiveness and about growth. So does it mean that we are, scaling back on green policy, and we think we have to push growth more at the cost, at the expense of green, of our Green Deal? So what's your assessment of what Draghi said?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the report is clear on the ambition to achieve the EU's climate objectives. And I think this is an important message because it gives a clear framework and direction to secure investments and therefore also the long-term competitiveness. But the problem is the future of our energy-intensive and clean tech industries, and not necessarily because of climate policies and the regulatory costs that come with it, but because there are a number of competitive issues and challenging global market conditions. So to your question, yes, while there was a strongly pronounced Green Deal focus in the work program of the last 5 years, which has brought important climate policies on ground, think about ETS2, CBAM, which is going to start. This report is putting the essential question of how to link the low carbon transition with the issue of economic competitiveness at its core. And importantly, the report is also very open and speaks out that there is a real possibility and risks of Europe not being able to seize opportunities from decarbonizing as a driver of competitiveness. And it recognizes that in such a case, Europe may have to face difficult trade-offs, including scaling back on some maybe environmental ambitions. So in this sense, I read the report as climate protection is still the firm goal. It can be the driving force of a positive innovation and investment shock that we need, but climate protection may not anymore be there at any price. So maybe next slide, to start with some of the competitiveness issues in the key sectors in the transition that the report identifies. The EU suffers first from a gap compared to major trade partners, US, China. See the two left graphs here in terms of competitiveness of energy prices. So industrial prices for energy are 2 to 3 times higher for electricity compared to the US and China, 3 to 5 times higher for natural gas prices. There's also an issue with respect to increased price volatility and the unpredictability of prices. And another problem is also that there's price differences for energy between EU member states, which are up to a factor of 2.5 for electricity, and that fundamentally reflects the lack of an integrated market, insufficient transmission capacity, etc. So on the right picture, you see another competitiveness challenge for the clean tech sectors, which are, of course, the enablers of decarbonization. And the EU is, as you can see on that graph, is one of the world's largest markets for clean tech, with China and the US as its main competitors. And Europe is a global leader in high-value inventions in clean techs. And that is also due to public funding at the EU and national levels we've seen in the past. So the EU has, on one hand, a strong potential to lead innovation in clean tech in the future, but there's also issues with respect to the ability to scale up. So the EU has been an early mover in building the manufacturing base for clean tech, but now China, and that's what you see there in the graph, clearly dominates the manufacturing capacity. China has massively built over capacity. So by 2030, it's expected to have double the solar PV capacity of global demand and about 1 times at the level of global demand in terms of manufacturing capacity for batteries. So there's a potential for being an innovation leader, but also challenges to scale up. And so maybe next slide. What does the report now propose to address the competitiveness challenges that the EU faces? Well, first of all, the energy sector, the energy intensive industries and the clean tech sectors are made a top priority in that report and in the industry plan. So about 40 out of the 172 proposals in the report are on these sectors. And these 40 proposals pursue 2 objectives in parallel. First is to improve competitiveness by lowering the cost of the energy system. And second is to improve competitiveness by accelerating decarbonization. So what are the main ideas on how to achieve this? What kind of policies are behind the proposals? Well, in a nutshell, the recipe for competitiveness given by the report is 4-fold: decarbonize, invest, thirdly, industrial policy, and fourthly, more Europe. So to lower the cost in the energy system, the report makes a number of proposals aimed at lowering the cost of natural gas and increasing the level and integration of renewables in the electricity sector. So for natural gas, in terms of the main ingredients of the recipe, it is in large parts more Europe, and this includes establishing partnerships with reliable and diversified trade partners, but also to reinforce joint procurement, to develop strategic import infrastructure for LNG and so on. For electricity, again, as for natural gas, the main cost-cutting policy is more Europe, with proposals that essentially aim to strengthen the EU single market for electricity. For example, there are a number of proposals which rightly emphasize the need to improve and invest in network energy infrastructure and the electricity grid to facilitate electrification of the economy at lower cost. So clearly building out the grid is key to tap into low-cost renewables. What I think is missing in the proposal is a leap forward to create effective market and policy support mechanisms to coordinate national energy sector investments across borders. So markets and mechanisms to encourage investments in the EU today are still national, and there's no mentioning in the report to really change that fundamentally. So for example, where there's a common renewable energy target in the EU, which are woven into the national energy climate plans, which determine national targets for renewables. What is missing is a market-based support mechanisms for renewable, for example, a tradable renewable energy standard for Europe that would incentivize the best renewable investments in an integrated market and help to keep energy prices as low as possible. So to lower electricity prices, there's also proposals which include decoupling the remuneration of renewables from fossil fuel generation. And this is in principle a good idea, as it can help to de-risk investments and facilitate market-based renewable capacity expansion. Let me maybe now go to the industrial policy ingredient on the next slide. So what are the proposals here? And I think here there is really a large paradigm shift that, if implemented, would propose a reform to essentially Europeanize the question of supporting energy-intensive and clean tech companies. So again, there's more Europe at the core of a number of proposals. And the key proposal is to come up with harmonized support instruments, essentially subsidies. And some of the options suggest carbon contracts for differences, competitive bidding to allocate state aid, and so on. And of course, instrument choice is always instrument design. So there are some known drawbacks from carbon contracts for differences. For example, the high information requirements on the government having to decide which technology to subsidize. If subsidies to uncreative incumbent industries are granted, then it's also not clear how fiscal spending would improve competitiveness. On the other hand, there's an economic rationale for subsidies if there are knowledge creation and diffusion spillovers. So besides this carrot element of industrial policy, the report is also frank about protectionist elements that are considered necessary. For example, if the CBAM proves to be ineffective in protecting the domestic market. So let me conclude maybe with a few words on proposals made about financing the industries. And so here I agree with the analysis in the report that the EU budget and other EU public financing sources are in fact not really targeted to clean technologies and manufacturing. So there is an EU Innovation Fund, and this is the only instrument which is fed from revenues by the emissions trading system, which is explicitly targeted to manufacturing of clean tech. But its volumes are really minor, and there's also no evidence that meaningful amounts of ETS revenues have been channeled to clean technologies manufacturing by the member states. So the report makes relatively short and vague proposals about maximizing the earmarking from ETS and CBAM revenues. And I think this is a key issue, this financing of the subsidies, which is underdeveloped in the report. And of course, it's a politically contentious issue. But I think if this paradigm shift towards a Europeanized industrial policy is really meant seriously, the funding has to be secured. And it makes a lot of sense to link this to the revenues generated from carbon pricing and to reap this innovation dividend from carbon pricing at a larger scale. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian. One can get a little bit lost in all the different proposals, but my understanding is that I guess the American word would be double down, yeah? So that it's not saying we have to, do less clean and do more industrial policy, but to really use industrial policy to be even stronger on our clean plans and our plan to decarbonize the industries and the society in the end. I will come back to you with a question in a second, but let's go to our last part for the presentation, and that's Friedrich. And you see, Friedrich, they all want money, yeah. So we need money for security, we need money for the green, we need money for the digital, for the innovation gap. And so he has clear plans, that should be European money and not national money. Yeah. So is that a good plan he has?
Yeah, the financing issues, they have made the headlines, and me as a public economics guy is always the road to emphasize also the budget constraints. I mean, one thing is clear, any reference to joint borrowing immediately triggers emotional reactions, especially in Germany. But the report is much richer, also on the financing side, than just about borrowing. So one key, we can immediately move to my first slide, Achim. So one key element is that it rightly points out that if in EU investment policy and industrial policy is well targeted, according to the usual macro modeling, this could increase output a lot. So you see the simulation results from the standard macro models, and could be financing, self-financing to some extent. I mean, when I hear about self-financing proposals, now this immediately reminds me, of the arguments of supply side tax cutters who promise that their ideas will be self-financing, and very rarely just materialize. So the crucial question is, can we really be more optimistic about this Draghi spending, the European industrial policy and investment policies? And here I'm a bit skeptical also with respect to the history of EU spending. Take cohesion policy, the EU biggest investment policy, and it has mobilized hundreds of billions of euro over past MFFs. And always in each MFF, you had the similar kind of macro modeling indicating ex ante, this will be a big growth push in the lagging regions and also to some extent self-financing. And this simply has materialized only to a very small extent. And we recently had a big project on cohesion policy, where we also surveyed very carefully the existing literature. And the bottom line from this precedent of a really, really large EU investment policy was that the growth impact is very limited. If it exists, it does not exist in those regions who would need it most. If it exists, it's often very short-lived. And this has to do with the political economy of EU spending. So that there's a lacking focus on results. Irene mentioned the evaluation issue. I mean, EU spending is evaluated a lot, but there are no conclusions often drawn from project failures. And of course, there's a very political thing in it. The member states are preoccupied with just looking at the return flows. And we should not be naive. We should expect the same mechanism to impact now when these Draghi funds would come. And the report is really not interested in this political economy of EU spending. It also does not provide any new ideas on how to improve EU spending efficiency, of how to make it more results-oriented. It just assumes that EU spending can suddenly be much more successful than it has been in the past. I'm following MFF negotiations now since the 1990s, and this is a very familiar narrative, which you also find now. So the narrative is as follows. Yes, in the past we had spending, this wasn't successful, but now we have a new idea, a new recipe. Now we will be much more successful than in the end. And I do not see in the report the new governance ideas that could really shield this spending against the usual political interest now to have fixed country allocations, to have sensitivities, industrial policy, which is the best connected industry, etc., etc. We know all this. What I like a lot in the report, and I think what deserves all the support, is a call for restructuring of the existing budget. So what you see here, the money is not allocated to the real priorities. Agriculture policy and cohesion, they still absorb together 60% of the core budget. But for my taste, this report's request could have been much stronger and a bit more specific. So there's a lot to mobilize in the existing budget. Just one example, in the current MFF, about 250 billion euro are spent on a per hectare transfer for farmers, with a major economic impact that it's increasing the land price for relatively rich landowners. And this is something where we spend 250 billion without what many reports tell us, European Court of Auditors, etc., that this does not incentivize to a significant extent like more ecological farming. And I would have expected a much clearer statement from a courageous report, so that it should really shake the given budget structure. Let me now turn to the next slide, the triggering issue. The triggering issue, the recommendation for more EU debt to finance all this, and the argument that the EU could provide a safe asset. And what the report does not reflect, and this is also valid for many other statements in this direction, the considerable disappointment about the relatively poor funding conditions of EU bonds. What you see here on the left-hand side are the yield spreads of 10-year government bonds relative to the benchmark issuer, which is Germany. And the EU has here a spread about 60 basis points. It's not better than like Portugal or Belgium. France was a bit better until the recent political turbulences, which have led to an upward shot of the French spread. But so the relative improvement of the EU is just because France has further deteriorated. So who is providing safe assets? The countries with a relatively high creditworthiness, Germany, Netherlands, Ireland, Finland, they are providing much safer assets from the perspective of the market. And that's natural because the EU has no taxing power. It just depends on contributions from the member states. And this bad financing conditions, by the way, they had a consequence that the majority of the EU member states have rejected the offer to borrow from the European Union under the Recovery and Resilience Facility, simply because the funding conditions were not attractive from them. So they can take up money cheaper in the market when they do it on their own, because the EU is a relatively unfavorable condition. So right-hand side of this slide, you then see that it's all putting a lot of pressure on the EU budget, much quicker and much higher than it was expected when NGO was decided in 2020. You see here that compared, this is research from Bruegel colleagues, compared to the plans, the interest burden has doubled because of a general increase in interest rate and the relatively unfavorable financing condition. So I think this report, but also other prominent reports like the letter report, they miss one essential point. They grossly overrate the potential and the fiscal space of maneuver which the EU has in the bond markets. It's limited. It's not very favorable. Last point, so we can move to the next slide. This is now a much more general observation. What I did here, I looked at how other big reports on competitiveness, which factors they consider when they analyze competitiveness. So this is here, this here the factors that are looked into by the IMD World Competitiveness Report, and I indicated in green those factors which the report really nicely covers, so the Draghi report. But you see here in blue those who are really neglected, and that's really striking. That the report, the Draghi report, pays a surprisingly low attention exactly to those factors that are particular weaknesses for many EU member states. That's the competitiveness of the tax system, of poor government spending efficiency, of an inefficient welfare state that costs a lot of money, but often with very limited results. And also on the business efficiency side, the high labor costs. So the report is almost silent on all these things. Just to give you an example, for taxes, it discusses taxes mainly, and Sebastian referred to it as a cost driver for energies, but that's just a tiny part of how taxes damage the competitiveness of EU economies, through higher costs across all kinds of inputs, prominent labor. And last thing, it also simply almost ignores the big challenge of demographic. It just mentions it in the context of the shrinking labor force, but not in terms of how this puts pressure on the welfare state, on the budget, and will also lead to a further increase of taxation, which will seriously damage European competitiveness. And simply from a report who wants to give a guidance for the coming year, this is quite striking, that there's such a mismatch between those things that really, on a broad scale, reduce European competitiveness and that are hardly paid attention to. Thanks.
Yeah, Friedrich, thanks, and thanks also for that slide, which kind of gives a general assessment what's being done in the report and what's not being done in the report. So I will stop the presentation and let's discuss a little bit. And if you have questions, so to all our the people joining us, please type it into the Q&A, and we try to pick it up. And Irene, I would like to start with you. So. When I read Draghi's report on this, on the innovation gap, I'm reminded about 20 years ago, the Lisbon strategy, and the plan citation to make, that was Lisbon, to make the EU the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world, capable of sustainable economic growth with more and better jobs and greater social cohesion. It didn't work out, obviously. Yeah. So does he discuss why it didn't work out, and does he has better proposals? What do you think? And put it to you, because you know you're all in this expert advising the German government. Is he missing something in his report? You think his report is really pinpointing the essential points?
Well, I think he gives a quite good analysis on this and also points to the weaknesses in the system. And I think it's less related to money than to the governance and to the regulatory frameworks that we have. So we still have regulatory burdens across EU member states. And as I mentioned before, now with the regulatory framework for AI, we really have to take care that these are harmonized rules and so on and so forth. And here I think he provides a good analysis and also provides good suggestions, but I think some of his suggestions are too much focused on increasing budget, and that's not will not be the solution in my point of view. But the priorities should really focus more on the framework conditions, harmonize the framework conditions for companies, for researchers, for startups, and so on. And okay, having more money for some things is good, of course, but here the EU should also attempt to incentivize more private money to be provided, for instance, for venture capital and things like that. So I think it's more on regulatory issues and then on money. And here maybe the Draghi report is not balanced enough, but he points to the important issues, I think. Yeah.
There's one question in the chat is whether it's also a cultural issue, and Europe is different from the United States. We are more worried about failing and so on. Is that a point which he should have stressed more?
Yeah, of course. There are some cultural issues. I mean, this is already also discussed for years now that in the US. First of all, there is less regulation and companies act until they are sued. Yeah, and in the EU, we try to regulate because we want to have legal security for the companies, and before they do not have legal security, they do not act. So this is a cultural issue, and also the provision of venture capital, for instance. Here are differences in between the US and Europe, and of course we cannot wipe away these cultural differences. This is an issue, but we can work on the regulatory framework and on the harmonization. I think that's something we can tackle. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks. So Sebastian, let's move to you. So I was, there are many proposals. What I was missing somehow is the European policy on climate. I thought it's, our main instrument is the emission trading system. And that should be the heart, and the rest should evolve out of that one. But I was reading just a little bit. Is that just my feeling, or did I read it? I didn't read all the 400 pages, I have to admit. So what's your take on that one? Sorry, you're muted. You're still muted, Sebastian.
Yes, so I also find this a bit disturbing. There's not a lot of mentioning about carbon pricing. And why is this not mentioned? I mean, I can only speculate, maybe on a communication or a political level. I mean, the report has a clear focus on industry policy and emphasizes lowering costs, subsidizing energy sectors. So I guess talking about carbon pricing policies which increase costs and maybe doesn't fit into that picture. And also the last program, the last World program was focused on strengthening carbon pricing, and much has been achieved and cast already into legislation. We've seen a legislation with increased emissions caps, scope extensions in the emissions trading systems, the new ETS2, CBAM, and so on. But maybe more fundamentally, and there I agree with also your observation, I don't understand how a longer-term vision, which is what this report represents, can be silent on how the European carbon pricing architecture should look like. And the instruments have been defined. They've largely been calibrated for until up to 2030. But there is a need to think about the post-2030 carbon pricing architecture in the EU. And after all, carbon pricing, for good reasons, is a lead instrument for climate policy. And achieving the EU budget in the years to come and going towards climate neutrality, that largely rests on the three regulations we have: the ETS1, the ETS2, and the effort sharing regulation. So this is really the key instruments that make sure that we hold our budgets. And there are important questions about how to overcome in a post-2030 period the fragmented carbon market that we have between ETS1, ETS2. There are still national carbon budgets which are built into the effort sharing regulation. And these raise first order questions about the where flexibility and efficiency of carbon abatement. And there's also a potential issue with a double regulation of emissions under the ESR, the effort sharing regulation, and the new ETS2, which may also have some implications for the effectiveness of the ETS2. So yeah, so clearly these design choices, they lie ahead of us, and they will also majorly influence the competitiveness. So yeah, so I would say this is one of the weaker points of the report, that this whole picture is missing. So carbon pricing is only talked about when it comes to the financing of subsidies.
Okay, maybe it's a long question, but maybe a quick answer on it, because there's one question here on tariffs. And it seems to me that the tariffs debate is also climate debate. So we were talking about CBAM, which will be a strong tariff thing. We are now talking about e-automobiles with regard to China, even if it's kind of an infant industry argument, but it's also climate protection. So is he doing a good job on tariffs, and how the structure, how tariffs will support the climate policy? My feeling is that also the Americans are discussing more the tariffs, but there's more and more the debate tariffs in favor of climate protection, so like a CBAM construction. Yeah, if countries don't have the same climate policies, they should pay a tariff. So is that a topic in the report?
So CBAM is a topic, as I said, to the extent that some of the revenues may be used for financing subsidies. And then there is the issue raised that if CBAM is not effective enough in terms of protecting the domestic market, that there should be a close monitoring and possibly a review of the CBAM design, right? Which could include postponing the phase out of reallocation, to increase shielding the domestic industries, but also then compensating European firms in foreign export markets.
Okay, thanks. So turning to you, Friedrich, there's one question. They don't believe you that they will restructure the EU budget, because that was on the agenda for the 20 years. So if they don't be able to restructure the European budget, yeah, so I think many economists are arguing we need money for infrastructure. We need, in Germany, but in particular also in Europe, and to have, cross-border electricity, cross-border gas flowing, cross-border trains, digitization, cross-border. If I understand you correctly, you would say, in principle, it's a good idea, but it never worked out on European level, because once you start this structure, it's, this infrastructure fund or whatever you call it, it will be not used for an effective means. So it's political economy is the problem. It's not an economic issue. It's political economy issue, yeah. Right?
Yeah, right. I mean, in ideal world, when we would have this this well-defined public good, public infrastructure with cross-border externalities, and there's a very clear case for European financing. I think to really judge the success perspective, it's also important to look at the European spending, national spending together, and we had this famous additionality principle in the past. So the idea that when EU finances an investment project, this should somehow be additional to what the member states do, because otherwise we have just a substitution. So the EU spends something from new resources, perhaps debt or anything else, and then the member states save this money and puts it into the next increase of the salaries for the civil servants. Then it's simply on a gross perspective, it's not additional, and the EU budget is really bad to press for this additionality. It has been given up as a formal criterion for cohesion policy spending, and there's a really crucial issue. And on this question, will it be possible to reshift the priorities in the budget? Yes, I'm not so optimistic. One reason that I'm not so optimistic is that the Draghi report did not push further for it, because the Draghi report has a strategic role, right? It has been developed, commissioned by the European Commission, and you can infer that it's also like a strategy. And I would have expected from a Draghi report to push much more openly into this direction, to give the Commission some backing for a more aggressive policy on restructuring the budget. It has failed to this opportunity, to seize this opportunity. That's why I agree. I'm also not very optimistic now.
Okay, thanks. So time is over. We will have one very fast final round of you three. What is the first priority? If you were, von der Leyen, what would you do out of the Draghi report? And I will start with my one. I think the resilience board is a very good suggestion, because we have to understand much better what it really means to have resilience, and this how to understand better. I think we should institutionalize it, and that would be the resilience board. So Irene, what is your one thing?
So mine is, unsurprisingly, the digital technology and digitalization issue. I think we really have to invest heavily here, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of frameworks and so on, because the AI revolution is taking place now.
Okay. Sebastian, one thing.
I think to Europeanize the question of supporting energy-intensive and clean tech companies is crucial, and to prevent a distorted market, and also prevent member states from outcompeting each other in a potential race to the bottom.
A very good point. Friedrich?
Yeah, not surprisingly. So restructure the budget, prioritize it correctly, but connect this with better governance. So evaluation, performance-based budgeting, etc. This would be the way forward.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks to you three. Thanks for the audience for joining us. There's still a few questions, but I think we will have a much longer debate on the report in the years to come, or in the months to come, and that combined with the agenda of von der Leyen. Thanks you all for joining. We will put it on our YouTube channel, then you can see it again if you want to, or tell your colleagues to see it there. And yeah, I hope that you will join our events at some future stage. Thanks for joining, and goodbye.